Hey guys, Scott here. Today we're going to go over the top 10 best decisions that Behaviour has ever made for Dead by Daylight in opposition to the last video. So let's get right into all of the best things they've ever done. That was it. Thanks for watching. No, actually though, they have done a number of very, very good things for the game, and I did have to be a little bit precise for this. So I had to kind of eliminate ones that were just fixing mistakes that they made. Like, I'm not going to include fixing Legion as one of their best decisions because it was just them fixing something they shouldn't have done to begin with, so I don't feel like that's fair. What I want to do is focus on mostly things that are not necessarily giant problems, but something that they came up with kind of on their own and just added. And, you know, things like endgame collapse, which didn't quite make this list, but things like that, where we're like, oh, that's kind of cool, actually, and they just added it to the game without it being a massive fix of something they horribly messed up. So, coming in at number 10, to get right into it, we're going to look at the removal of gen tapping. Back in the day, generators could not even be kicked by the killer. Then they added the ability to kick the generator, and then ever since then, they've been buffing that more and more because kicking gens was not really ever worth it unless you had a build dedicated to kicking generators. So this patch actually made it so the gen tapping feature of stopping the regression was no longer possible. It used to be that a survivor could just walk up and tap a generator for one little millisecond, and that would make the regression stop. That was extremely frustrating as killer because we had to walk to it, do a lengthy kick animation, and then walk away from it, and a survivor could just go boop and cancel all that progress. It was very frustrating. Additionally, the same patch, they buffed the regression from kicking the actual generator from 2.5 to 5%, which made kicking gens even more effective. Unfortunately, this kind of coincided with a lot of generator kicking buffs, perks, and things like that, so it was a bit of a tumultuous time for different perk-related reasons, but the actual base change they made to stop the instant regression from tapping the generators was actually really good and just widely accepted to be a very, very smart idea. Number 9, the addition of conspicuous actions. A conspicuous action is effectively anything that progresses the game from the survivor side. So if you try to heal something or do a generator or anything like that, that is considered a conspicuous action. Now, that's not really relevant unless we talk about the perks that is related to, namely Decisive Strike. That was the main one. Decisive Strike back in the day was an absolute menace, complete pain in the ass to deal with as killer. Basically, you were just always going to get Decisive Strike. Even if you weren't tunneling or anything like that, you would still get Decisive Strike. It was incredibly annoying to deal with. Now, the problem was there were things like the small PP build, which was Decisive Strike and Unbreakable, which meant that if the person was unhooked, they were effectively just invincible. There's nothing you could do to them. If you down them and slug them, they would just pick themselves up with Unbreakable. If you tried to pick them up, they would have Decisive Strike. They could do a generator in your face while all this was happening, and there's nothing you could do to stop it. So it was basically free minute of pure invulnerability after they got unhooked, and that was very obnoxious. So now, a conspicuous action would take place if they touched that generator, for example, and that will remove the protection they have. Basically, it's the game saying, okay, if you're doing a generator, you're obviously not being tunneled anymore. You don't need this anti-tunnel protection perk or anything because you're doing a gen. You're obviously not being tunneled anymore. So the game now acknowledges that, and now a survivor, if they want to keep their Decisive Strike, their off the record, anything they've got like that, defensive layers for, anti-tunnel, if they want to keep all that stuff up, they have to actually be getting tunnel, which is great. That means it punishes killers that tunnel, but it doesn't reward survivors who have just simply been unhooked recently and they're just playing the game normally now. So removal of conspicuous actions, or I guess the adding of that to prevent people from abusing things like Decisive Strike and off the record as offensively as they used to. It's still done a little bit, but it's really good because, if you get hit with a Decisive Strike now and it's been, 50 seconds since the unhook, that survivor's been useless. They've been doing nothing the entire time. So that is always at least a good feeling. If I do somehow get hit with a DS, I know that guy has not touched a generator in the entire duration of that time. So that's really, really nice to have. Same thing with off the record. So conspicuous actions were a very good addition and relieve a lot of frustration on the killer side. Next, this one seems kind of minor for number 8, but it's just simply not starting games when someone disconnects before the game loads. I know this seems like such a minor thing, but back in the day, in like 2016, 2017 region, if somebody disconnected during the loading screen or they alt F4 because they didn't like a map offering or just something wrong happened before the game actually started and there was only 3 players, you would have to play the 3v1 out. Now, it would remove a generator, but that's not even close to a good enough trade to justify that match being played out. It was basically if you spawned in a 3v1, you just had to play a doomed match as Survivor. You were just not gonna win. And that felt really, really bad because the killer could just basically tunnel one guy out and then the game is effectively over. And so that was extremely frustrating to deal with on the survivor and killer side. Even as the killer side, I never want to play it 3v1 because it's almost impossible to lose if you know what you're doing. So it was just boring on both sides, and not a lot of footage to show what I'm talking about here. There's not really anything more to talk about. It was just a really good change to make lobbies not start with a non-4 player lobby or non-4 survivor lobby. It was so frustrating to have to play 3v1s. A very simple one here, but incredible quality of life. Number 7, the Survivor HUD update. This is the update that added progression and like meters and gauges and everything to the Survivor UI on the left to let your solo queue teammates know exactly what's going on. This has been incredibly beneficial to solo queue. A lot of times you don't know if someone's going for a save, but now due to process of elimination, you can kind of figure that out. You see some guy getting chased with the little chase symbol. You see one guy on a hook. You're on a generator, so everyone knows they can see the gen progress, so they know you're working on a gen. That indicates that, hey, the 4th guy should probably go save. Now, does it always work? No. Solo queue is definitely full of people that don't know what they're doing, but it helps immensely with information for those things. I can't tell you the amount of times seeing someone working on an exit gate lets me know that instead of running the killer here, I'm actually just going to run right to the exit gate because it's about 70%. And right before I get there, it's going to be, it lets you plan out things that you would only be able to do with communication with solo queue teammates. And that is incredibly beneficial because solo queue is without a doubt the weakest role in the entire game. Statistically, in my experience, it just without a doubt is the weakest role in Dead by Daylight. So it really, really needed buffs for that. And they are really substantial. Lets you know when a heal's about to be completed, lets you know when the last gen's about to pop. I can't tell you the amount of times it's been so useful to know that a generator was about to pop, the last one, and I will run to a door, and the second it pops, I'm on the door. So, 15 seconds later, it's open. Killer cannot believe how the door got open that fast. He thinks it's comms and stuff like that, but no, it's just using the gauges that you see on the actual UI lets you make extremely good plays. Seriously, my favorite part about this, though, is the increased gen efficiency on the solo queue survivor side. Like I said earlier in that example, it lets you know when you need to devote time to going for the save, or maybe you need to stick on this gen, because if you see 3 people or something not on generators, it likely indicates that someone is, about to be chased, or they're about to go for a save or something, and then you can stay on that gen. And again, I know it doesn't always work out like that. Sometimes you both just end up leaving a guy on hook, but more often than not, it lets you be much more efficient with generators, and that's a massive problem in solo queue. So adding that UI was a very welcome change. Anyone complaining about that is the most killer-sided lunatic that you have ever seen. There's absolutely not a single reason you should ever be complaining about that, because solo queue is just by far the weakest role in the game. So definitely a very welcome addition. I cannot think of a single downside to adding that Survivor HUD update. Very, very good. Now, number 6 is Base Kit Borrowed Time. Borrowed Time is an effect that happens. It's a perk on Bill, but we just call it Base Kit Borrowed Time because it's effectively the same thing. When you unhook somebody, they retain endurance for a few seconds after the unhook. Endurance makes it so if you're hit, you go into deep wound instead of being downed. Back in the day, if someone was unhooked, you just hit them and they died. There's nothing they could do. And they would basically, everyone had to run to Snipes to Strike because there was just no defense against the killer just tunneling you off the hook, because you had no invulnerability. You would just die immediately. And so that is a very, very basic but game-changing addition that a lot of people were initially pretty salty about, at least on the killer side, but anyone with a brain could see that that was a good idea. It's not exactly engaging gameplay to have someone take you off a hook and you just die in 1 second later because you physically cannot do anything else. It's just a very, very stupid idea to have that be part of the core gameplay loop. So adding this change was extremely beneficial because now people have, a 10-second window to get at least somewhere safe. So if the killer does want to tunnel, they at least have a bit of a head start to maybe get to a window or a pallet and give themselves somewhat of a chance. It's still not a very good chance because depending on where they're hooked, it might not even be anything nearby, but at least it gives the survivor who's being tunneled at least a little something to deal with it. So a lot of these changes are, killer sided, but a lot of these are survivor sided as well. It's kind of like an even balance that kind of shows that they have been addressing problems with both sides for a long time, despite, my siders, people that only play one side, pretending that they only balance in favor of the other side. They've kind of been pretty even in terms of a lot of the stuff. I think they've balanced towards killer sided a bit more, but that's because the game just used to be insanely survivor sided. They had to balance more towards killer because it was like 90-10, and now it's like 40-60, maybe a little bit in favor of killer now, depending on their stats and depending on a bunch of different variables, but these are overall pretty balanced changes, at least in my opinion. And yeah, Base Kit Borrowed Time was something that was definitely needed. And the fact that it was tied to a perk before made it like you never want to have core gameplay design tied to perks. And I know that's one of the biggest problems that they do. So them going back on that philosophy and making it part of the base kit and then buffing Bill's perk to extend that duration is really nice. Additionally, a little side note, the self anti-unhook or the self anti-face camp unhook meter. If you unhook yourself with that, you actually get nearly a double duration borrowed time. A lot of people don't know that. So little things like that are really cool, and it did stop the incredibly boring gameplay of killers just smacking you immediately off the hook and you're just dying. If someone didn't have borrowed time, you had to run borrowed time or you would just be farming people every single game. So excellent change, and I don't think many people are opposed to this at least anymore. Number 5. Adding exhaustion in general. A lot of people don't know this, but in the very first year of the game, exhaustion did not exist. The abilities that are now exhaustion perks just had internal cooldowns. Sprint Burst notoriously had just a 20-second cooldown that recovered while you were running, meaning you would Sprint Burst like 4 times in a single chase. It was absurdly stupid. Then they added Balanced Landing, which had a much longer cooldown, but still, there was no exhaustion. So you were still able to combine things that, are normally exhaustion perks, and you could recover while running as well. That was nightmarish for Killer and made those perks way, way too strong. So eventually they did add exhaustion to all of these increased movement speed perks. Now, the original version of exhaustion was still kind of unbalanced because you could recover while you were running still, but it would recover at a slower rate. Still though, with a good enough chase, you could balance landing, for example, multiple times in the same chase, whereas nowadays it's virtually impossible without some type of gimmick of any kind, like, Blood Rush or just something like that. So it was extremely abusable. And even, like I said, the first versions of exhaustion were still not enough. It was still too easy to recover it mid-match and chase and stuff like that, until they made the final current version of exhaustion where you simply do not recover exhaustion whatsoever when you're running. That is by far the most balanced form of it, and there are still things that can shorten your exhaustion, like Vigil, for example, but that is definitely the best way to do it, and it makes sense. If you're exhausted and you're sprinting, why would you lose exhaustion? You're still sprinting. So even from a realism sense and a lore sense or whatever, it makes sense. It's a good change, but more importantly, it allowed them to add more exhaustion perks and not worry about them being able to stack anymore. That was really the main problem, being able to stack them together without any downside or detriment. And adding exhaustion made it so, you couldn't just slap on 4 exhaustion perks and be zooming across the map the entire game. It was a very, very welcome change. And also it allowed some additional perks and add-ons to attach to that mechanic. So now we have add-ons that cause exhaustion and we have perks that cause exhaustion. So it added a new dynamic for perks to bounce off of, and it made the game far more balanced for the killers as well. So overall, adding the concept of exhaustion in general to these movement speed perks was an absolutely vital change, whereas before they were so wildly overpowered, I don't even know how they existed in that state of the game. Number 4, the Hatch rework. A lot of people remember the ancient days of the Hatch standoff. For those who don't know, the Hatch standoff was this incredibly stupid scenario where a killer and a survivor get to the hatch at the same time and nobody can win. It's essentially a stalemate and a battle of who is more stubborn. If the survivor tries to jump in the hatch, the killer can grab them, the survivor dies. If the killer hits the survivor, they cool down, survivor jumps in the hatch, can't be grabbed, survivor wins. So it was this incredibly stupid standoff that happened to people with too much ego, and some people would just sit there for hours and hours just waiting for, I guess, an additional amount of blood points. It was so dumb, and that's not even the worst part about how the hatch used to work. So the hatch used to not appear when there was just one guy left. It would basically be, there was some math that determined when it would appear based on the amount of gens done and how many people were dead. But you could have this scenario where one guy was dead and the hatch would appear if there was 1 gen left. So it was kind of interesting because this did cure 3 gens in the sense that, if you had a key, everybody could escape, and it was really stupid. But at the same time, it was wildly imbalanced, where it punished the killer for doing better as the game neared its end. Because if you were in that scenario, as I have been many times in the past, where there's 1 gen left and 3 survivors left, you essentially just lost as killer, because the survivors did not have to engage with the generators anymore. They could grab whoever has their key, follow that guy, open the hatch, they all jump out, not a thing you can do about it. And that was really dumb to be winning and then instantly lose because of one mechanic like that. So the change and the rework they did to the hatch made it infinitely more fair, where it's still just sort of a last-ditch effort for one guy to escape, and that's all it ever should have been. The killer should not lose because the game offered some sympathy to the survivors who are losing that was just asinine to have. So now it's a sympathy mechanic for just one person. At that point, the killer's already won, so it's not really a sympathy mechanic where the killer could still lose. It's just more like, all right, give this guy an escape. You still win, killer, but you win a bit less now. So it's far less damaging to the killer in that scenario. And the ability to kick the hatch closed as well, I think, is also a pretty interesting mechanic. And I'm not gonna lie, it favors the killer, but that's the point. That scenario should favor the killer. It should be like 70-30 in favor of the killer. The survivor should only be having a chance to escape because they lost. It's just a pity escape. It's not like, oh man, you making a sick play. You just, an RNG thing spawned on you. Now you're better than the killer. No, it's just a pity escape. You guys lost. You deserve to lose in that scenario. So the fact that it leans towards killer is completely understandable and fair in that scenario. And typically, if the killer does get to the hatch first and kick it closed, the survivor is probably going to die. Now, there's a couple of maps where the survivor can actually get to the exit gates and open it before the killer can realize it. It requires a lot of skill on the survivor's part, knowing how to do only a portion of the gate so it doesn't light up yet, and then hiding perfectly. It requires a lot from the survivor to get out in most of these scenarios, other than like one or two maps where it's actually very hard for the killer to account for it. It is usually going to result in the killer winning in that scenario, but I think that's good. Like I said, the hatch mechanic should never have been everyone on the survivor team wins because the killer is doing well. It should just be a pity escape for the last survivor, maybe, that you get sometimes despite your team losing. So the changes they made to hatch, removing the hatch standoff and not appearing when there's multiple survivors left, was an absolute no-brainer decision. If you're mad about that on Survivor, I don't know, get good. Realize that it's absolutely a good decision for the game. You got to take a step back and think about it from the killer side. Why should they be punished for doing well? It makes no sense. So overall, hatch change, very, very good. Coming in at number 3, medium vaults. Again, I feel like I'm saying this phrase a lot, but a lot of people didn't realize that medium vaults didn't exist when the game came out. It was slow or fast, meaning you could have no momentum towards a window whatsoever and just fast vault it immediately as long as you were performing a rushed action, which was dumb as fuck. You could medium vault, or you could fast vault from any angle. Nowadays, you have to have a running start to the vault. And I really like this change for a number of reasons. One, it's just way more balanced. It doesn't make any sense a survivor could have this insane momentum fast vault while standing still. But also, it adds a really cool skill element and a skill ceiling to Survivor. Knowing how to angle yourself for a fast vault on very hard to do fast vaults is a really cool skill to learn. Like learning how to do it on the top of the game drop-down window, like just doing it like that because you can fast vault that. And it does make it better for you if the killer's really close. Knowing how to angle those things, knowing how to delay your vault to the last second so you actually retain the momentum and do the fast vault, all of that stuff added a really cool skill ceiling to Survivor that I actually really enjoy when I'm playing Survivor. And on the killer side, it just made the game way more fair because you cannot even imagine how dumb it was chasing people that could fast vault from any angle at any time. It was impossible to catch people for a number of different reasons, but that was one of the compounding factors to infinites back in the day because, yeah, there was no angle required. You just held shift, vaulted, you're doing a fast vault. So adding medium vaults, absolutely no-brainer, completely changed the game for a much, much better way. Number 2, removing vacuum pallets. So I believe this is around, I started the game in 2017, a bit before Leatherface came out. And I lived through this. I lived through the era of the vacuum vaults. Vacuum vaults were not what we're talking about now, where you run past a pallet and kind of vacuum back to it. Oh, no, no, no. Oh, no, 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 no. Vacuum vaults back in the day were if you approached a pallet and press spacebar, you would instantly teleport to the other side, and you can physically dodge hits by doing this. It basically gave survivors dead hard at every single pallet. Old dead hard that gave you distance, not even the endurance one. So think about how incredibly annoying that is. You're about to hit a survivor, you're right next to them, you're just in melee range, but they get to a pallet, you swing, and they just teleport to the other side. Now, they did this so the animation would match up properly, but it made it so wildly unfun and unbalanced in favor of Survivor that killers, like, it was just such a nightmare to deal with. You could not outplay it. How are you supposed to outplay that? You can't outplay someone teleporting through a pallet. It basically gave survivors an extra loop on every single loop in the entire game with a pallet because they could effectively just teleport and that would give them the necessary distance to loop around one more time. It was utterly ridiculous, immensely frustrating. This one wasn't even as game-breaking as other things, but it was so immensely frustrating as killer to have to deal with these types of mechanics. I would have people like dodge Huntress hatchets by just teleporting out of the way. That's back when I was learning the game and learning Huntress, but oh my god, vacuum pallets were an absolute nightmare. They doubled the value of every loop on the game in a time where there were double the pallets on every map in the game. And that was, yeah, absolutely a nightmare to deal with, removing vacuum pallets. Oh, thank God. Now, it did have a little bit of a downside to where now on bad connections, a survivor might get hit while dropping a pallet, whereas before they would obviously teleport out of the way. I don't care if you have 300 ping, survivor's just gone, it doesn't matter. But now sometimes on bad connections, survivors will get hit through the pallets, and that can be annoying when I'm playing Survivor 2, but I will always take the trade of removing that in exchange for occasional laggy hits through pallets, because oh my god, I cannot tell you how frustrating that was as killer. Finally, coming in at number 1, a lot of people have different ideas for this, but they all typically center around the same topic, which was infinite loops in the game. But the main benefactor to removing that was the addition of the entity blocker. I think this is the single most impactful change that has ever happened to Dead by Daylight. It actually effectively crushed the infinites that had plagued the game for a very long time and actually started to make the game a bit playable for Killer. This was the first major change that really made Killer actually not a nightmare to play. So when the game came out, there was no entity blocker. For those who don't know, if you vault a window 3 times while in a chase, it becomes blocked for 15, 30 seconds, I forget the exact time, but it effectively makes that tile unusable for a short period. But when the game came out, that didn't exist. So you could just vault a window that was way too safe. Killers vaulted much slower at the time, so the killer couldn't vault and come after you, so they'd have to try to mind game it left to right. Doesn't matter. You could just fast vault, standing still, back and forth forever. And this made infinites. This made it so a killer physically could never catch a survivor until the heat death of the universe. It could never happen. There are infamous clips of like Baru chasing someone on the old Ironworks of Misery window for like 4 hours. I tried to find a clip of it, but it's lost to time now. But it is the single most impactful change the game has ever had, adding that block to a window after 3 vaults. It made it so these incredibly abusable windows could only be abused for a short amount of time, and then the survivor actually had to play the game for a little bit. So that was immensely satisfying to see as a killer, and it was without a doubt the most impactful change the game has ever had in its history. It completely changed how every map was played, and it has been a mainstay in the game ever since. And thank God for that, because if you guys didn't play during the time when that did not exist, absolute nightmare. Luckily, I started, I think, right around when they added it. I don't even remember if when I started it existed or not. I was so new to the game, I wouldn't even know if that was the case. But yeah, absolute nightmare. You've seen clips of it before. It made the game basically unplayable as killer when that did not exist. So there it is. That's my number 1. Entity blocker, I think, is the single most impactful change to be ever added to the game. It was by far the best decision they've ever done. A lot of other things that could have made this list. There's a lot of them, but a lot of them are just fixing things that they shouldn't have done to begin with. So it was a bit harder to hone in on the 10 for this list. But overall, those are my thoughts. I'm curious if you guys agree or disagree. Overall, though, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time.